Hello, are you able to hear
Yes,
me?
we can hear you,
Okay,
Manu.
okay,
We can hear you.
Yeah. We have Professor Upinder Singh with us today to deliver the lecture for August in Confluences 2022, which is iShore's monthly lecture series. So this is the 17th lecture that the Institute is organizing. For those of you who are new to iShore, iShore is Institute for Social Science, Humanities and Oceanic Research. It's primarily a research collective launched in 2021 by a group of young scholars from Kerala who work in a variety of disciplines: history, sociology, economics, gender studies, literature, translation studies. So the institute is meant to serve as a kind of platform for promoting research and advanced studies in these disciplines, as well as to facilitate dialogue between scholars and students in Kerala and other parts of the world. In fact, there is a greater measure of focus on students. So the institute wishes to provide them with the best possible resources for research and advanced learning. So I'm delighted to be here today to chair the session. Our guest today, Professor Upinder Singh, studied history at St. Stephen's College, New Delhi, and Delhi University. She was awarded PhD in 1989 or 90, I forget, by McGill University, Montreal, for a thesis, Kings, Brahmanas and Temples in Orissa, an epigraphical study. She then taught history at St. Stephen's and Delhi University before joining Ashoka University, where she is currently Professor of History. Professor Singh published her PhD thesis under the same title, Kings, Brahmanas and Temples in Orissa, which is among the few empirically rich studies on Orissa history for the period that it explores, which is from the 4th century to the mid 12th century. The book appeared in 1994. Now, one of my areas of research interest is the pre-colonial history of Orissa. So, and this book is always on my table when I'm studying sources from early medieval Orissa. In fact, it must be somewhere around. Uh, yeah. This actually means that I'm writing a paper on early medieval Orissa. Among her earlier works are Ancient Delhi and the Discovery of Ancient India, which is about the early history of archaeology in India, archaeology as a discipline, and Professor and Alexander Cunningham's place in this history. More recently, that is in 2021, she published a kind of what shall I call it? A companion volume, perhaps, to this particular book. So it's called The World of India's First Archaeologist. So this is actually an amazing compilation of letters that Cunningham wrote to one of his assistants, H.D.M. Begler. The Idea of India is a book that brings together a number of papers that she wrote. This book has important essays on sites such as Amaravati, Nagarjuna what else? Sanchi. There is a paper on Ashokan edicts. There is one on the Raghuvamsha. There is one on the Nitisara. Professor Singh has also edited a collection of essays on the early medieval period. It's called Rethinking Early Medieval India. And she has edited another book along with Professor Parul Pandyadhar. This is Asian Encounters. A third book that I can immediately recall is the one that she edited along with Professor Nayanjot Lahiri. This is Ancient India, New Research, published in 2009. This was a remarkable book because it was meant to bring together the works of a number of young historians and archaeologists who are all there in their 20s and 30s back then. Now, most historians and South Asian studies scholars believe that her 2017 book, Political Violence in Ancient India, is her magnum opus. This is a book that challenges a widely held belief that India has been a non-violent civilization. And she does this in the most effective way possible by suffusing the book with tons and tons and tons of historical evidence. But outside the academia, Professor Singh is best known for her famous textbook, A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India. It has been almost a decade and a half since this book was published, and today it has become the textbook that students fall back upon. And again, this is because of the exhaustive empirical material and exhaustive discussion of existing perspectives on ancient and early medieval India that the book brings together. We don't have a comparable textbook on Indian history for this period, this early period. Last year, she published another book, Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions. I'm sure today's lecture is based on this book. Professor Singh is also recipient of the Infosys Prize in the Social Sciences for the year 2009. She's in fact one of the earliest recipients of this prize. Thank you very much for being with us, Professor Singh. We also have with us today Dr. Sanjukta Datta, who teaches history at Ashoka University and heads the Department of History there. She's the discussant for today's lecture. She studied history in St. Stephen's College and Delhi University. She was one of the historians whose work was included in the book that I mentioned earlier, Ancient India, New Research. And I'm told that she is now working on a monograph on kingship in the Pala state. Welcome, Dr. Datta. Professor Singh will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and Dr. Datta will share her thoughts on it for about 15 minutes. We'll then open up the floor for Q&A. May I now request Professor Upinder Singh to deliver her lecture, Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions.
Thank you very much, Manu, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Mahmood, for inviting me to give this lecture. And I think whatever I've heard and learned about iShore, it's an excellent initiative. So I'm really happy to be part of this, this venture. The book that I'm going to discuss today, Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions, is very different from anything else that I have ever written. As Manu mentioned, my historical approach has always been very strongly empirical and focused on specific historical themes. The genesis of this particular book is that I had to teach a course on Indian civilizations to undergraduates in Ashoka University. And initially, I found this a very daunting prospect. I wondered, how do I convey something meaningful, something, something that makes sense to these young students without drowning them in a mass of detail? In order to make my course meaningful to my students, I decided to organize it around certain contradictions in ancient Indian culture and history, contradictions that can be seen even today. This book, Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions, that I'm going to talk about today, is an elaboration of what I tried to do in that course. It is a book for general readers who have an interest in ancient India. In fact, these days, there's a great deal of popular and political interest in ancient India. And I think it is more urgent than ever before to move discussions of history out of universities and academic journals into the wider world. I think that for far too long, most Indian historians have chosen to magisterially speak from the pulpit, usually to other historians, rarely to ordinary people. The enormous misconceptions and misinformation circulating at the popular level about history, and particularly about ancient Indian history, I think are a reflection of that is, historians' refusal to communicate with a larger audience. So we publish books and articles for scholarly peers, but there's a whole world out there of people who are interested in history, who are talking about history, and I think it's very important that we talk to them as well. The feelings of belonging and alienation that history can arouse makes it highly susceptible to manipulation. This makes it all the more necessary, I think, to explain history and historical method to non-historians. This is especially so given the overt politicization of history these days. In my book, I have tried to explain to general readers the complexities and textures of primary sources, texts, material evidence, etc. I have tried to explain that ancient sources are not simple reflections of the realities of their time. They are complex representations of those realities, and historical analysis involves rigorous analysis and arguments. It is difficult to do justice to a theme as vast as Indian culture or ancient Indian culture. I chose a few themes that I consider central to understanding ancient Indian history, culture, and thought. What were these themes? The coexistence of certain radical tensions and oppositions between social inequality and salvation, between desire and detachment, between goddess worship and misogyny, between violence and non-violence, and between debate and conflict. Interestingly enough, the powerful contradictions discussed in the book are not part of a past that is dead and gone. Although a great deal, of course, has changed over the centuries, we can see these contradictions around us in India even today. To engage the general reader, in my book, I bookended my discussion of ancient India with references and incidents from contemporary times. I will not summarize my book here. I will introduce some of the themes of the book and pay a little more time talking about my discussion of violence and non-violence. My book starts with a discussion of the contradiction between inequality and salvation. And it starts with a recent event. It starts with the tragic death of Rohit Vemula, student of the University of Hyderabad, and the searing critique of caste discrimination he left behind. It goes on to discuss how inequality has been part of all societies in all times in history, but its institutional forms and nature have varied. I focus on the early history of 4 bases of inequality in ancient India: slavery, varna, caste, and untouchability. The challenge is that the history of these institutions and practices and experiences of subordinated and marginalized groups have to be reconstructed on the basis of sources that give a very partial, biased, and from the top view, representing the interests and ideas of upper classes and religious elites. And I go on to explore the questioning of inequality, which mainly took place at the religious and soteriological level in Jainism, Buddhism, and the bhakti of the Alvars and Nayanmars. The questioning of inequality at the religious level in ancient India did not take the form of a clarion call for social equality, but an assertion of the potential of all to attain spiritual goals. These ideas led to the creation of new kinds of religious communities, such as the monastic and lay communities of the Jains and Buddhists, and those based on devotion to a supreme deity. Social inequality could not be abolished, but it was questioned, and one could opt out of it by giving up worldly life or focusing on higher religious or soteriological aspirations. When we think of inequality in ancient India, or in any time and place, there are many questions that need to be asked. How were the forms of inequality perpetuated? Was there docile acquiescence or was there resistance and revolt? The guardians and enforcers of inequality included kings, upper classes, and upper castes. Social and political ideologies made inequality seem natural and unquestionable and helped to maintain the status quo. Coercion, violence, and the threat of violence also played important roles. Events comparable to the peasant rebellions in China or the slave revolts in the Roman Empire did not happen in ancient India, or if they did, they are not documented. But political texts do express fears of social upheaval and rebellion, something that I'll say more about a little later. Every day, newspapers and news channels carry stories of brutal caste oppression and caste violence, and of honor killings where young people who dare to love across caste boundaries are killed, usually by their own close kin. All around us, we see all too vividly how violence is woven into structures of inequality and oppression. Can we really believe it was different in times gone by? I'm saying this because there is this picture of ancient India as a time or as a sort of idyllic phase of Indian history marked by peace and tranquility and harmony. And some of what is there in the book urges readers to actually question some of these stereotypes. My second chapter is about desire and detachment, the tension between desire and detachment. And it is the chapter I enjoyed writing the most. I start with one of my favorite, very short inscriptions, the Jogi Mara cave inscription, and go on to try to decode ideas about love and desire as represented in inscriptions, texts, and art of ancient India. Ancient literature in Tamil, Prakrit, and Sanskrit is permeated with the sentiments of love and the excitement of passion. Technical treatises contain the Kama experts' analysis of pleasure. Ancient art, which is found mostly in religious spaces, celebrates the human body and the love of man and woman, its representations ranging from subtle sensuality to the frankly erotic. Pleasure was recognized as a legitimate goal of human existence to be pursued with a sense of balance and in harmony with other goals such as dharma and artha, even moksha. Extreme love was justified only when it formed a template for a higher love for God. The love between devotee and deity was visualized as reciprocal, intense, sublime, a path to a higher spiritual goal. Here, there was no possibility of excess. In tantric ritual, sex was divested of its associations with desire or pleasures. So I'm trying to show and point out that there are many different perspectives on love, sex, and desire in ancient India. These diverse perspectives, which attach different kinds of positive value to love, sex, and/or desire, coexisted with a strong tradition that viewed all these, indeed the body itself, as sources of bondage and suffering. The control of sexual impulses and acts was central to several ascetic systems and was a cornerstone of Jain and Buddhist monastic practice. One could be a good Jain or Buddhist by following the teachings laid down for the laity, but one could not attain liberation from samsara, that is the cycle of birth and death, without giving everything up and joining the monastic order. Liberation required transcending all forms of attachment and desire. And renunciation is an important and extremely important element in the Indian cultural tradition that casts its shadow across the centuries. I go on in my book to discuss the apparent contradiction between the worship of goddesses and social structures in which women face many different forms of subordination and oppression. Across the centuries, the idea of the feminine principle as embodying fertility, auspiciousness, and plenitude coexisted with the idea of women as having negative and destructive potential. In the religious sphere, although the central foci of veneration and religious authority remained male, female deities had a strong presence. The story of goddess worship in India is not one of submergence in male-dominated religion, but of increasing vibrancy and importance. Goddess culture formed a strong, continuing aspect of popular belief and practice, cutting across sectarian identities and divides. From the 19th century onwards, the nation too has been visualized as a goddess, Bharat Mata. Even today, apart from female deities known from texts, goddesses of childbirth and disease are worshipped in villages across the length and breadth of the country to provide succor for everyday concerns and anxieties. However, it should be fairly obvious, but somehow it isn't to many, again, at the popular level, that goddess worship did not and does not translate into empowerment for real women. Within patriarchal social structures, women have always faced different degrees of subordination, depending on their class and caste and on the kinship structure. Many texts indicate increasing efforts to control and confine women within the bounds of the family and household. But the continuing attempts to control and discipline women suggest that rules were not always followed and had to be hammered home century after century. The statements about the proper behavior of women and wives or rather their improper behavior in many ancient texts sound depressingly familiar to attitudes prevailing in India today. But then as now, clearly there were women who did not conform and who dared to strike their own path. The ambivalence in ancient Indian texts towards women had multiple roots: attitudes towards the woman's body, sexuality and procreative potential, the patrilineal obsession with the production of sons, the need to control women's behavior in order to perpetuate the caste system, and the perception of female sexuality as posing a threat both to male celibacy and virile power. Male-dominated social and political systems offer certain spaces within which upper-class women can exercise their agency in various ways. But these spaces were and are very narrow for non-elite women, whose experiences of subordination and oppression are qualitatively different and are largely undocumented in the sources of ancient times. I suggest in my book that the golden age for Indian women, if we want to think of one at all, does not lie in the past, but in the future. My fourth chapter talks about the tension between violence and non-violence. This is a continuation of my earlier work on political violence, but I extended it. And it takes as its starting point another one of many misconceptions about ancient India, the misconception that ancient India was marked by harmony and non-violence. Again, it should be fairly obvious that it was not, but somehow there is this misconception that is widely pervasive. The issue is actually very complex. How do we define violence? Apart from violent actions, what about violent speech, thoughts, emotions, and intentions? What about the various forms and theaters of violence in the political, in the social, religious, and environmental spheres? What about public and private, visible and hidden violence? In all cases, the line between justified force and unjustified violence is difficult to draw and depends on perspective. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the violence of the state. It is something I discussed in my book, Political Violence in Ancient India, and I also discuss it in Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions. Like inequality, violence too has always been a part of human history, although its scales, its forms and intensity have varied. The advent of the state ushered major changes in the structures for its perpetuation and control. My book, Political Violence in Ancient India, documented and discussed how the increase of political violence was accompanied by increasingly sophisticated attempts to legitimize, invisibilize, and aestheticize it. Apart from warfare, certain forms of coercion and violence were and still are inherent in the state. Throughout history, states have been based on the systematic appropriation of economic and human resources from subjects. In ancient agrarian societies, rulers took a share of the farmer's grain in the form of taxes. Extracting taxes on a regular basis involved coercion and the threat or actual use of force. The harnessing of labor for state projects also involved coercion. Violence was also inherent in the interactions of ancient Indian states with forest people. The expansion of agriculture, cities and states involved the steady clearance of forests. But the really massive forest clearance in the subcontinent took place in the middle of the 19th century as a result of population increase, commercial farming, and the expansion of railways. Till then, states lived cheek by jowl with forest tribes. Extracting and controlling valuable economic and military resources like elephants, wood, and ivory involved a steady encroachment on forest habitats and constant conflicts with forest people. The forest was an important object of the exploitation and violence of the state, but it was also a constant source of violent challenge to the state. The pejorative term "lecher" included tribals as well as foreigners and presented them as a threat to so-called civilized people. But it could also be used to justify the use of violence against tribals. Beyond the pervasiveness of warfare in ancient Indian political history, I have argued in my book that war was central to ancient Indian culture, as it was to many others. And I'm here talking about the centrality of war in the Sanskrit epics, or in the epic traditions, I should say, the centrality of war in the Sangam poetry, the Puram poems, which are pervaded with a warrior ethos. And in all these texts, war forms a context within which many other important issues are discussed: human relationships, social duty, the goals of life, happiness, death and its aftermath, heaven and hell, and the relationship with the gods. While political theorists deliberated on the nature and conduct of war, poets, playwrights, royal biographers, and composers of royal inscriptions celebrated the military prowess and victories of kings. Through an elegant sleight of hand, they divested war of its ugliness and violence and presented it as something necessary, desirable, even beautiful. What about violence against the state? The upheavals of ancient Indian political history indicate that kings and dynasties were frequently challenged by rivals. Further evidence of threats of violence against the state comes from reading between the lines of texts, especially taking note of their expressions of their apprehensions, insecurities, and anxieties, and references to kings who do not discharge their duties properly. The Mahabharata discusses the king's duties and warns of the consequences of not performing them. A just king goes to heaven, an unjust king goes to hell. There are other warnings as well. In one place, the epic states that a cruel king who does not protect his people, who robs them in the name of levying taxes, is Kali incarnate and should be killed by his subjects. A king who, after declaring, "I will protect you," does not protect them, should be killed by his people coming together as though he were a mad dog. There are several stories in ancient Indian texts of evil men who are also kings being killed. Duryodhan, Ravan, Kans are some of the well-known ones. But the overall attitude of the Mahabharata, indeed of all ancient Indian texts, is pro-government and pro-monarchy. Kinglessness is seen and presented as the equivalent of anarchy. The most comprehensive and pragmatic discussion of violence against the state occurs in the Arthashastra. Kautilya advocates ruthless, carefully calculated, and effective use of preemptive and post facto violence by the state in order to prevent and respond to violence against the state. But Kautilya's king lives in constant fear of assassination, especially at the hands of his wives and sons. Kautilya advises the king to have an elaborate espionage system and to deal firmly with revolts and conspiracies. Those who cannot be killed openly, such as high-ranking officers, should be dealt with through silent punishment, upanshu danda, that is secret killing. Silent punishment can also be used against hostile subjects. There are many warnings in the Arthashastra about popular disaffection and prakriti kopa, anger or uprising of the people. These suggest an anxiety about the possibility of a mass rebellion of unhappy, dissatisfied subjects. Social conflict and violence were not absent in ancient India, but their presence has to be largely inferred from sources that usually muffle the voices of discontent or dissent. Such conflicts were often dealt with and diffused, though not entirely resolved, at the religious level. Gendered violence. In my recent book, I have extended my discussion of violence to examine the issue of gendered violence in ancient Indian texts. Sanskrit Kavya presents an idyllic picture of polygynous royal households and harems, thronging with mistresses, queens, slaves, and servants, where women of varying rank and standing were available to kings for their pleasure and the production of heirs. However, if the aesthetic veneer is peeled off and texts are read against the grain, the image of the happy harem dissolves into something ugly. Dharma Shastra, the Sanskrit epics, the Arthashastra, and Kama Sutra provide some entry points. Of the 8 types of marriage listed in Dharma Shastra texts, 2, the Rakshasa and Paishacha types, involve violence. excuse me, the Rakshasa or demonic type of marriage is defined in the Manusmriti as when someone violently abducts a girl from her house as she is shrieking and weeping by causing death, mayhem, and destruction. The Paishacha or ghoulish marriage, which was considered the most evil, is when someone secretly rapes a woman who is sleeping, drunk, or deranged in mind. The references to womanizing, Stri Vyasana, in the standard list of the king's vices in Sanskrit political discourse recognizes the propensity of kings for sexual indulgence and excess. Excuse me. So sexual indulgence was considered all right in moderate doses, but problematic when it became excessive. There are several episodes of violence against women in the political domain in the Mahabharata and Ramayana. In the Ramayana, Ravan uses brute force while abducting Sita. In the Mahabharata, Dushasana, as is well known in the episode, violently drags Draupadi by the hair into the assembly hall and attempts to disrobe her publicly. Clearly, the epic's composers did not approve of such behavior, but the fact that these incidents are described in graphic detail and form extremely important parts of the epic narratives suggests a recognition of sexual violence against women as a feature of the political domain. The Kama Sutra has an entire section on the sex lives of powerful men, which focuses especially on kings. Vatsyayan recommends strategies that these men can use to ensnare other men's wives. He recommends certain secret methods involving subterfuge as well as force, which he says are generally used by princes. He also refers to the sexual violence of kings. It should be clear that texts of different genres discuss the issue of force against women, especially by politically powerful men. In some situations, they consider it as legitimate force, in others as illegitimate violence. By the early centuries CE, although there was a broad cultural consensus on the positive value to be attached to nonviolence, the specific views varied considerably in their grounding and emphasis. This emerges clearly from a comparison of two figures who are often considered opposites, Ashoka and Kautilya. The Maurya Emperor Ashoka has rightfully earned the reputation of being a remarkable king who renounced war and devoted his life to a vigorous project to make people follow Dhamma, which included non-violence. Kautilya, on the other hand, was a proponent of realpolitik, for whom the ends justified the means, and the ruthless pursuit of power justifies deceit and killing. Therefore, it comes as a bit of a surprise that there are several similarities in their ideas. Both Ashoka and Kautilya associate kingship with benevolent paternalism, ensuring the welfare and happiness of all beings in this world and helping them attain heaven in the next. In Ashoka's Dhamma, the appropriate conduct towards all living beings is one of compassion, gentleness, and abstention from injuring and killing. The Arthashastra acknowledges the ethics applicable to everyone, which includes non-violence, truthfulness, purity, freedom from malice, non-cruelty. So the text refers to ahimsa and amrishamsya. While Ashoka's concern for animals is well known, Kautilya's is not. The Arthashastra lays down punishments for causing injury to humans and also to animals and plants. It refers to animal sanctuaries, abhayavanas. Both Ashoka and Kautilya extend the application of the principle of non-injury to animals and expand it to include measures for animal welfare. However, there is a big difference in rationale and emphasis. Ashoka's commitment to non-violence was rooted in his reflections on the problem of violence and his faith in the Buddha's teaching. His edicts imply that violence towards other beings injures life and leads to the incurring of sin, papa, and demerit, apunya. Kautilya's valorization of nonviolence may sound hypocritical, considering the numerous places where he advocates ruthless actions involving injuring and killing human beings. But Kautilya was not a votary of unrestrained state violence. He sanctions all measures that are considered necessary for the king to maintain and enhance his political power. For Kautilya, While human life has greatest value, although this value varies depending on social status, the value of animals lies primarily in their being an important item of private property and an economic and political resource for the state. That is why they are to be protected against injury, theft, and killing. While there are occasional glimmers of compassion that extend beyond the utilitarian frame, Kautilya's general perspective is a pragmatic one, where the chief aim is maximizing economic gain from animals, especially for the state. Ensuring their welfare is essential for this. So although both Kautilya and Ashoka talk about the protection of animals, they do so from very different points of view. Another major difference between the ideas of Ashoka and Kautilya can be seen in their attitudes towards war. Ashoka's Rod Edict 13 is a remarkable reflection on the consequences of war. It describes the king's victory in which, in the Kalinga War, which took place in the 9th year after his Abhisheka. Ashoka announces that he has given up military victory for Dhamma Vijaya, victory through Dhamma, which consists of propagating Dhamma within and beyond the frontiers of his empire. Dhammic victory, he asserts, is the best because it leads to fruits in this world and the next. But while heralding a new idea of Dhamma Vijaya, there is also an element of pragmatism in Rod Edict 13. Ashoka urges his sons and grandsons to aim at Dhamma Vijaya, but recommends mercy and moderation in punishment if they do engage in warfare. After exhorting the forest people to follow Dhamma, he reminds them of the power he wields in spite of his repentance and warns them not to provoke him, lest they be killed. For Kautilya, war is a normal part of political life, but should be waged after a clear calculation of the likelihood of victory. In his listing, the righteous victor, Dharma Vijayan, is one who is satisfied with mere submission. But there is a big difference between Kautilya's and Ashoka's ideas of righteous victory. Kautilya's Dhamma Vijaya is the most noble form of military victory. Ashoka's Dhamma Vijaya is not a military victory at all. It consists of the propagation of virtue and goodness. So while there are some interesting similarities between Ashoka and Kautilya's vocabulary and even ideas on nonviolence, there are also significant differences arising from different premises and goals. Ashoka wanted to make people good and virtuous. Kautilya wanted to control subjects and to harness their interest to those of the king. Ashoka's aim as king was to create a new world moral order. Kautilya was concerned with material rather than moral welfare, but his great achievement was to demonstrate that furthering the welfare of the subjects was in the political and material self-interest of the king. It is not easy to define violence, nor is it easy to draw a line between justified and unjustified force. Where that line is drawn depends on perspective. These days, vegetarianism is an issue that is much discussed in the popular media. I discussed this also in my book, and it's so obvious and clear that vegetarianism was by no means the norm in ancient India. But the issue of violence goes far beyond dietary habits. Ancient Indian history, like the history of other parts of the world, is replete with violence of various kinds. War is the best documented, but other forms of political and social violence can be identified or inferred. The intellectual reactions to violence included moral, political, and aesthetic ones. Attitudes towards the violence of the state, including war, were fairly pragmatic, even in the religions of non-violence. All textual traditions distinguish force that is necessary, proportionate, and legitimate from that which is considered unnecessary, excessive, and illegitimate, thereby leaving open a window for questioning the state's tyranny and coercive power. Were ancient Indians non-violent? Obviously not. Were they less violent than people living in other parts of the world? To answer this question in detail, we need a comparative global history of violence. But one thing is certain: ancient Indian intellectuals, political theorists, philosophers, and religious leaders discussed the tension between violence and non-violence, perhaps more intensely than anywhere else in the world. How is the amnesia about violence in ancient Indian history to be explained? It comes from an idealized interpretation of Indian history. It comes from a hop, skip, and jump approach that magically connects Mahavir, the Buddha, Ashoka, and Gandhi, and leaves out everything that comes in between. It comes from the centrality of nonviolence in the Indian freedom struggle. Gandhian nationalism contributed in a big way towards creating the illusion that nonviolence was somehow ingrained in the Indian psyche. But even Gandhi, the modern icon of nonviolence, struggled throughout his life with the problem of violence and met his end through an assassin's bullet. Nonviolence acquires its deepest meaning in the midst of intense violence. The last theme I discuss in my book is debate and conflict. In communally charged times, hurting religious sentiments is an allegation that flies all too easily. Apart from writers, artists, and filmmakers, historians too find themselves in the bad books of religious orthodoxies very often. The charges are usually based on ideas of monolithic and antagonistic religious identities. How have these ideas come to dominate? And how is it that in spite of the communal prejudice and conflict all around, Indians still, at least some Indians, still persist in thinking of themselves as a tolerant people? The word tolerance can include a wide range of attitudes, including indifference, superficial engagement, genuine dialogue, and concord. This work, I think, makes sense in a monotheistic context, especially in cultures where there was a close relationship between the state and church. And it is a bit out of place in the context of ancient India. So rather than talking about tolerance and intolerance, in my book, I've examined issues such as philosophical dialogue and debate, classifications of philosophical schools, and the Astika-Nastika divide, hagiographies of saints and religious leaders, royal religious policy, the relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism, and Jainism and Shaivism, and I've also discussed religious satire. I don't have time to go into all the details, but ancient India had a long and lively tradition of philosophical dialogue and debate on issues such as dharma, the nature of reality and existence, ethics, and the path of liberation from samsara. Debates were usually games of one-upmanship to demonstrate mastery and superiority over other ideas or systems of thought, but they nevertheless show the existence of a spirit of vigorous thinking and questioning among intellectuals. The growth of knowledge is not possible without such thinking and questioning. The crystallization and consolidation of religious identities in ancient India involved give and take, competition, critique, and polemic. The existence of many multi-religious sites across India does not necessarily reflect a situation of religious harmony or peaceful coexistence. While texts, especially hagiographies of saints, give a picture of sharply defined boundaries, actual religious practice reveals shared elements and a picture that is much more syncretic, hybrid, and fluid. At the political level, although there were some episodes of violent religious persecution by kings in ancient times, the more usual policy was one of multi-directional religious patronage, with the patronage of Brahmins forming a constant. This pragmatic response to a variegated religious landscape led to a certain level of hybridity that became a part of the culture of royal courts and must have permeated to some extent into the larger social sphere. In more recent times, with increasingly monolithic and antagonistic understandings of religious identity, tensions between religious communities exist in a heightened state, ever ready to explode. Shrill diatribe prevails over genuine dialogue, which does not, in fact, really seem to exist at all. In more recent times, we have seen religious conflicts, mostly in the context of control over religious sites. For instance, Shaivs versus Buddhists at Bodh Gaya, Digambars versus Shvetambars at Sammed Shikhar, Hindus versus Muslims in the decades-long Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid dispute at Ayodhya. The last of these reached a legal conclusion after many decades of litigation and a great deal of tragic violence. In ancient India, There were multiple religious communities, but no state religion. Perhaps there is a lesson here for our own times. I want to now sort of tie everything up and present my conclusions. Many distorted views of the past emerge from judging and using it to serve the agendas of the present. The image of ancient India as a utopia of social and religious harmony and non-violence is a false one. So is the image of ancient India as a dystopia marked only by inequity, conflict, and violence. Beyond glorification and denigration, there is the possibility of trying to understand how the multiple threads of the past are intertwined with each other, not only in terms of facticity, but also of ambiguity, contrast, tension, and contradiction. While discussing the different aspects of ancient Indian cultural traditions, the conjunction or is best replaced by and. As shown in my book, there is evidence of both inequality as well as promises of universal salvation, a valorization of desire and detachment, goddess worship and misogyny, violence and non-violence, religious dialogue and conflict. Just as extraordinary as the range of contradictions is the fact that they seem rather familiar to Indian readers. The reason is that in spite of the passage of centuries and the enormous changes and upheavals of history, somehow these contradictions still live on. Many of the texts, ideas, and symbols I discuss in my book too live on in the form of appropriations, recastings, even reversals. The adoption of the Sarnath capital of Ashoka as an emblem of the Indian nation state, and of course now we see another strange version atop the new parliament building. The adoption of the Sarnath capital of Ashoka as an emblem of the Indian nation state at the time of independence reflected the Nehruvian understanding of Ashoka as a representative of the positive values of peace, harmony, and cosmopolitanism. The Ramayana and Mahabharata are well known, much loved and influential across India and parts of Southeast Asia in their various oral, written, and performative tellings. While the Ramayana tradition usually sees Ram as an exemplar of virtues, in Periyar's writings, he is seen as a symbol of northern Aryan tyranny. Duryodhan is a villain in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, but there are temples dedicated to him in Jakhol village in Himachal Pradesh and Malnad village in Kerala. Kautilya lives on under the more popular name of Chanakya in corporate self-help books and on a recently issued 5 rupee coin commemorating 150 years of the Indian Income Tax Department. In sharp contrast to the Puranic stories of Durga Mahishasura Mardini, in Dalit counter-narratives, the demon Mahishasura is a heroic figure representing oppressed indigenous people and lower castes. The hard-headed and kill rather than be killed stories of the Panchatantra have been transformed into humorous comic books for children. Such reversals seem less surprising when we consider that they are part of very long-standing traditions of interpretation, reinterpretation, and counter-narratives. The ancient past, especially the epic past, has inspired innumerable modern writers, artists, and filmmakers. In my book, I have referred to the works of some of my favorite modern artists who have been inspired by elements from ancient India. If we choose to seek inspiration from the ancient Indian past, there is a large menu to choose from. However, I think it's somewhat ironical that people living in a modern democracy should make appeals, often of very different kinds, to traditions rooted in hierarchical and unequal societies governed by autocratic kings. These appeals are usually based on very selective reading and decontextualizing of the evidence. As I mentioned at the outset, ancient societies accepted the idea of the natural inequality of social groups. This is the antithesis of the principle of natural equality, a fundamental premise of modern democracy. The principles of liberty and equality first made their appearance in Indian history with the promulgation of the Constitution of the Indian Republic. The inspiration for a better future, in my view, should come not from a past that is long gone, but from aspirations for a future that is yet to come, one which we hope will be better than the past or the present. I'm saying this because in the present context of an increasingly authoritarian and intolerant state, it has become fashionable to talk about the ancient Indian tradition of debate and dissent, and to present these as inherent aspects of Indian culture and civilization. Questioning and debate there was, plenty, but we should not forget that in the unequal, hierarchical societies of ancient times, these were luxuries generally limited to small elite groups. If we must extract some takeaways for our times from ancient India, it is better to choose some of the elements of the model of an ideal ruler, that such a ruler must be utterly impartial in the administration of justice, must not be motivated by considerations of personal favor or profit, and should not be swayed by a lust for power. This ideal is as valid in discussions of ancient monarchies as it is in modern democracies. In fact, Kautilya's warning of cruel and unjust rulers meeting their nemesis due to prakriti kopa, anger of the people, suits modern democracies better than ancient monarchies. With this, I think I should end, and I'd like to thank you for listening patiently to me. And over to you, Sanjukta.
So, hello, should I step in right away?
Yes, why not?
Oh, okay, thank you. I thought if you had something to say, or should I just?
No, in fact, for those of you who might be interested in the book, this is the one. This is published from Aleph in 2021. A small bit of advertisement.
Thank you. So let me begin by thanking Aisho and especially Mahmood Puria, my colleague, for inviting me to be a discussant. It's a wonderful book, and I'm very glad to be able to say a few things about what I think is important about the book. But first, I think congratulations to Upinder Singh on the publication of your 8th monograph. I'm not counting the book that you wrote on archaeology for children. That would make it number 9, but I think 8 for the time being. And let me say why I think this is an important book. I thought that this is an excellent introduction to the history of ancient and early medieval India. But let me also add how very different this is from the author's 2008 magisterial chronological survey of the longest and the earliest period of Indian history. So a history of ancient and early medieval Indian history, the textbook that Manu Devadevan referred to a little earlier, is fundamentally different from this book. And what makes it different is something that Upinder Singh herself talked about, that instead of a chronological framework here, the focus is on 5 very obvious major contradictions that seem to permeate ancient and early medieval Indian histories. I'm not going into the 5 contradictions about which the author herself spoke at length, but I think if there are people in the audience who have been bewildered by the explosion of explicit sexual imagery on the temple walls of Khajuraho and Konark, then this is a book that might offer some helpful, interesting insights. I also thought that the book is written with remarkable clarity in an accessible style, something which the author hinted at a couple of minutes ago, that this is meant for not the specialist academic audience necessarily, but a large interested audience who would like to engage meaningfully with the ancient past. And even though it is written, as I said, with remarkable accessibility, the formidable scholarship of the author, 4 decades of a deep study of matters related to ancient and the early medieval Indian history, come through in every page. And I think it is something that should be celebrated, that the text is not heavy. I mean, her scholarship doesn't make the text or what she's talking about seem pedantic. the conversational style, allowing for the empirical evidence to speak for themselves, I think is a very important contribution. If I take just one example, and that has to do with the dazzling diversity of sources that the author is grappling with. I'm in no way focusing exclusively on Sanskrit sources, but just taking it as one example. So if you're talking about textual traditions in Sanskrit, the range of works that the author alludes to, hymns of the Rig Veda, Upanishadic debates, the huge corpus of the Dharma Sutras and the Dharma Shastras, Sanskrit Kavyas, celebrated texts that many of us are excited about, the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra, for instance, right? Among several others. And this is not to mention hagiographies in Kannada, erotic poetry in Prakrit, and several other linguistic traditions that she refers to. I'm not even going into the archaeological material. So I think the wealth of the sources, allowing the sources to speak for themselves, I think is an important contribution. And I think I responded very positively to that. One other thing I also thought that the book goes a long way in doing, and that is to alert both the historians and the readers. I mean, I'm assuming that the readers were not historians in whatever capacity, everybody involved in the experience of the book, in the semantics and the vocabulary. So I was pleasantly surprised, and I remember waiting for a minute or two before moving on to the next sentence when I encountered Upinder Singh making the distinction between the words sensuous and sensual. Right? These are easily collapsible terms that we often use, sometimes a little too callously. How about the notion of tolerance that she spoke about a few minutes ago, right? What is the incorporative capacity of such a term? Is it okay to use such a blanket term in ancient Indian contexts, or should certain caveats be incorporated? What is monolatry, monotheism, polytheism? I think are again very important interventions, the moment that she's taken to explain these terms before moving on to talk about the rich empirical data. The other thing I think, which is very, very exciting about the book, is the showcasing of the beauty of ancient Indian art. I think another alternative title for this book could be A Brief History of Ancient Indian Art. My suggestion for the author is that the next time it goes, if there's a reprint version or if there's an updated version, please push your publishers, if you can, gently, justified and unjustified violence, since you talked about, so not unjustified, to get a few colored photographs of ancient Indian sculptural art, right? So works of Arpita Singh, Nilima Sheikh, A. Ramachandran, of course, are bright and colorful. What about the Ravana from Aurora or Mahabalipuram, the Arjuna's penance, right? So a little bit of color for ancient India would be great. And I think I have one or two questions, and if I can probably maybe take it from here, which is that I think that for a long time, ancient Indian art, particularly sculptural art, hasn't been showcased in the way that it can be. And I think your book marks an important stage in that. So not only the power of words, but the power of imagery. And it's not just another historical source, but this is a kind of experiential remnant of ancient and early medieval India. So my first question to you is that, how has this happened to you? Have you responded to ancient Indian art over a long period of time. I mean, you've co-edited a volume with an art historian, Parul Pandya, right? So, I just wanted to know what are some of the various lineages, inspirations that gently pushed you towards incorporating the visual material the way that you have done. That's one. And connected to that is, what do you think are some of the possibilities for other historians to use ancient Indian sculptural material? I mean, how can this be more meaningful, more exciting, and how can it speak much more to people? Let this be the first question, and then I have one or two, not too many. Yeah.
Manu, should I go ahead?
Yes, you please.
So Sanjukta, I trust you to ask a question that makes me think, now, I have to dig back, go far back into my history, my kind of right down to my student days. I think when I was a student, an undergraduate student, I was really excited. What drew me to ancient India was the mystery and the beauty of ancient Sanskrit texts. That's where I really got hooked onto it, and medieval and modern India, which I studied later on, just couldn't compare in my view. There's something very intuitive in my reaction to the primary sources that our teachers exposed us to. I think there was a stage after I started teaching where I did feel that ancient Indian history, now this is a different stage, was too text-based, that the material evidence from archaeology was not adequately incorporated into the historical narratives that historians write. So the first edition, I'm working on the second edition of my History of Ancient and Early Medieval India. The first edition of that book, which came out in 2008, actually expresses my dissatisfactions with the historiography of ancient India at that point of time. And one of the big dissatisfactions was the way in which archaeology was treated as a sort of lesser, as a handmaid of history, and the huge amount of data from sites and artifacts, the material remains of the ancient past. They were called on only when they, in order to corroborate what the texts said. Now that I am working on the revised edition, I've gone back and I find I've added another section on visual sources. So what has happened is, clearly, I found poetry always very interesting, but my attraction towards the visual sources came later in my evolution as a historian. And it comes from a kind of intuitive sort of reaction to the beauty of art. It's not something that is intellectual at all. It is how you respond to the truly magnificent and varied specimens of art in ancient and early medieval India. It also has to do a lot with my travels, because I don't believe in, just sitting, although during COVID, we did spend a lot of time sitting at our corner on our desk, but I feel it's really important to experience and understand history, to visit places, to visit sites, to go and see them, and, understand artifacts and archaeological data and sculptures in their original setting. So I think the fact that over the last 20 years, at least, I've been really traveling a great deal, that has broadened my understanding of history. It's also brought the visual very center stage, because the most wonderful places to visit, sites to visit in India, and also in Southeast Asia, Mahmood, you would agree, are the ones where you have magnificent art. So I think it's important for art history not to be, art historians have been doing wonderful work, but I think mainstream history students, mainstream historians need to make a much greater effort in acknowledging the importance of art, not just admiring its aesthetic aspects. There's so much more to it, but understanding that this is a very rich, evocative, and important source of history. So this is a very short answer to a rather interesting question. But for me, when I write a book, I think from ancient Delhi onwards, after I write the text, I spend a lot of time looking for the right visuals, months and months, and, sometimes give me much more, because I think it is important. The visual conveys sometimes something much more powerful than what the text says.
Thanks. I mean, it's interesting the way you responded to the question. And, while you were speaking, I also thought that there seems to be a parallel thread in the book in some ways, or that's how I looked at it, is that the continuous and complex legacies of ancient India. The visual carries a lot of that, right? So I think there is a serious need to probably get some art historical training if necessary. I was just thinking of ourselves as specialists in ancient and early medieval India, and then try and incorporate, as you said, it's not just aesthetic beauty, but much more that goes into thinking about ancient art. The other question that I wanted to ask was a little about the making of the book. Political violence in ancient India, 2017, you worked extensively on it, you thought about it for a long time. As you said, you've extended some of the arguments here, thinking about other kinds of violence, not just against the state or preemptive violence by the state, but other kinds of violence. But I was thinking about the chapter, say, on desire and detachment. And let me tell you, that is the chapter that I enjoyed the most. So the fact that you enjoyed thinking and writing about it is clearly quite obvious. So my question is, say, violence is something that you've been thinking about extensively. But love, if I'm not mistaken, is not something that you've written on a great deal. I can think about, for instance, say, on the Raghuvansha, and the Vyasanas, for instance, is something that comes into the question of the ideal king and how much of his intoxication in love is good for the state and how much is it not. These are ways that love has come in. I also remember for one of your book launches, somebody had asked, so Professor Singh, what are you going to work on now after violence? And I remember you had said with great interest that maybe something on love in ancient India. So maybe you'd been thinking about love. So if I sort of reframe the question, that there are themes that you worked on and there are those relatively new, for instance, bhakti and the potential of bhakti to bring in social change or social revolution, right, is something that you have not written on extensively. So in the making of this book, two things. How did some of these themes emerge? Did you have to work your way through some of the themes? You knew violence has to be there. For the others, let me think a little harder. What are some of the other contradictions? And how did it all fall into place?
Okay, wonderful question again. Let me see. Yes, I did say at that launch of political violence, after reading and thinking about violence for 5 years, you do want something different. So I did think that I would work on love. I had been getting interested in the history of emotions, which is not a very well-developed theme in the context of ancient India. I mean, the history of ideas, political violence in ancient India reflects it's really a history of ideas, and which I think, again, is something that is really important, which not enough attention is paid to. And I think Manu would agree with his interest in ideas and intellectual history. And history of emotions is another very interesting and important field. So I did again, I taught a course on it in Delhi University, and I think that kept the interest alive. And I did incorporate some of that interest in my work on the Raghuvansh. But the themes in this book, how did they emerge? Sometimes you don't know. I mean, the themes emerged when I was some of the themes emerged while I was teaching this undergraduate course and trying to figure out how to organize the course. And again, I think the themes emerge fairly intuitively. Again, over probably a period of about 2 or 3 weeks. Violence and non-violence had to be there because I'd been thinking and working on it. But then it's a kind of, I guess, some kind of distillation of things that you have been thinking about, not necessarily have worked on in any great detail, but things that have been in your mind over many, many years, and then somehow taking a kind of coherent form. So I think that's really how it happened. I can't say anything more precise than that. But one other thing that did influence me, and this makes this book very different from my other books, because I've always believed that I'm a historian who's sitting there cocooned in the ancient past, and in some ways very self-consciously kept myself away from this kind of connecting the past with the present, so on and so forth. But in this book, that's not the case. I mean, I bookend each chapter with the present. And what I think some of the themes emerge from what I perceive to be some serious misconceptions about ancient India and the need to read, set the record straight. So apart from my own interest, that will also, I think, come through in this book and in the selection of themes. So the idea of a tolerant India, ancient India, the idea of a peaceful India, and ancient India where, everything was wonderful, a golden age for women. And we all know that. Those of us who do ancient India know that this is not the case, but there is a very large popular audience that does not read what historians usually write. And that's why I think it's important to speak to that larger audience.
Okay, one last question, a little tricky, or I want to make it sound tricky, maybe very easy for you. If somebody from Aleph approached you today and said, the book is ready to go into press, but you have the choice to change one thing, what would you have changed? How would you have done something differently since last year?
I wouldn't change anything. I think you need to look back at what you write with the one, maybe after 5 years or so, I'd look back. I mean, there's small things, of course, when you look at what you have written, you always find imperfections, things you could have expressed better, things you could have included, so on and so forth. But this book is still too recent for me to look at objectively. So, because I'm always looking ahead, I'm looking at what I want to do next. I don't want to analyze what I've already done.
Okay, thank you. That's very profound. I think let me not ask any more questions, and maybe the audience might like to ask questions. So back to you, Dr. Devadevan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singh, for a lucid and insightful lecture, and thank you, Dr. Datta, for engaging a response to it. Let's now take a few questions from the audience. The audience could either speak or type their questions in the chat box.
May I ask a question before someone?
Yeah, please.
Upinder, it's a fantastic, lecture, and I was mainly thinking about the last part. I started to read the book when I was in India, and I couldn't carry it when I went out, so I couldn't complete, reading. And the conclusion, in your lecture, possibly gives the idea of what the last part of the book is. So and usually when we teach history, we often think of the justification that we give for studying history or teaching history is that the very importance of the discipline is that it helps you to understand from the past good things or bad things and things like that. But in your lecture you give a very concrete argument for why not to study or why not to use the past. You might want to study it, but still may not be that useful to use it, or maybe instrumental use of the history, something, or very selective, as you rightly pointed out, like the very selective use of the past is something very problematic. So something very interesting, and I am still thinking, still processing that suggestion. But my question is probably a little bit very naive on the something as someone unfamiliar with the ancient Indian history, is mostly a methodological question. When you deal with when you work with a text like, or text like epics, right? When you have multiple versions of Mahabharata and Ramayana, and when you decide to work on a particular theme, let's say violence or sexuality or love, and I wonder, how you decide, which version, and there are multiple versions of all these epics, right, available down to us. And of course, there is also a critical edition, which is also another edition, along with many other editions, printed or unpublished, and so forth. So when, as a historian, when you look for not specifically for a text, what do you call it, like a text criticism, or like when the text itself is not your concern, rather you are looking for particular themes, like the ideas or violence and themes like that. I wonder, like how you decide to choose which version is more dependable, or or not, and so forth. And I ask this question mainly because in the last few weeks, I have been coming across this big genre of what they call, like in Sumatra in Indonesia, Tambo, which is mainly like a transition, I would say, transition from the Hindu-Buddhist Sumatra to the Muslim version, a Muslim period. And in between, like it's a lot of there are also handwritten manuscripts, but also printed editions, not yet a critical edition. And there is no connection between these texts, right? Or beyond the name, they just are called Tambo, but each village or each province has its own version. So I wonder, like as a historian, when you are not necessarily looking, or when you are not necessarily studying the text itself, rather for a particular idea, for a particular theme, what are the strategies that you employ when you have multiple versions available?
Okay, that's an interesting question, Mahmood. And I've had long discussions about this with people in the disciplines of international relations and political science, because I found they were interested in my political violence in ancient India, because some of the texts that I discussed, they're like the Arthashastra, are texts that they study from their own point of view. And, I've this idea that there are multiple, obviously, I have not gone back to the original manuscripts in a book of this kind, and we work with published editions. And what we do is wherever possible, wherever they're available, we go for the critical editions, of text. So for instance, if I'm looking at the Arthashastra, I will, go to Kangle's critical edition, which has the original text and the translation. I will look at Olivell's critical edition. Similarly, there are critical editions of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So you have to kind of make, that wherever there's a kind of an authoritative critical edition, that text is, that's where an ancient historian would go to first. So that's the kind of the way in which each one proceeds. But there are many texts for which you don't have critical editions. And in this book, I've dealt with well-known texts. I have not discovered new manuscripts or obscure or new sources. These are all sources that are well-known, published editions, translations are available. And of course, because the languages that the book deals with extend beyond Sanskrit, okay? So there is Prakrit, there is Tamil, and so on and so forth. There, I've had to rely on translations. And in translations, again, as we all know, all translations are not equally reliable. So you go for the translations that are considered most scholarly and most authoritative. So for instance, in the case of the Sangam poems, I have used A.K. Ramanujan's translations or George Hart's translations. And in the case of the Prakrit poetry, which Sanjukta, by the way, my favorite love poetry is the Gatha Saptasai, because I find it's remarkable. It is just so, and there I went by Matha and Selby's translations. So one has to make judicious choices based on, to some extent, the reputation of the scholars, but also the sense that you get of the scholarliness of the translation. So these are the kinds of strategies one uses in order to write something that is based on a large variety of sources, not on a single source that you can kind of, and these are sources in multiple languages, multiple types of sources also. So there was one more question. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
There was a question in the box about humor and satire. Manu, may I address that? Life is not all serious, and this whole history, we're always talking in very serious tones. Naturally, history is a serious discipline. But I mean, among the most delightful kinds of things that I had, works that I read along in the way, both for political violence and also in this book, the Panchatantra. What a delightful book. A book on politics, which gives kind of political lessons or lessons for everyday life through these absolutely delightful but pretty violent animal stories. What I talk about in Culture of Contradictions is the tradition of religious satire. This is, again, this comes from the kind of current climate where you find that, religious sentiments are getting hurt all the time. But there is a tradition, a long and strong tradition of satire, social and religious satire in ancient India. So whether it is the Matta Vilasa Prahasana, or whether it is the works of Kshaimendra or the Agama Dambara, it is important for us to recognize the existence of this of all these works. So that's my answer to the question that came in the box. There is much that I think we can do with about sources that have humor and satire in them, and they're just as important and interesting sources to work with as the usual sources that ancient Indian historians tend to focus on.
We have a major early medieval historian among the audience, Dr. Suchandra Ghosh. Would you like to comment on the lecture?
Oh,
I think she's typing.
Yeah, now, okay. Thank you very much, Manu, but I'm not a specialist in early medieval. I don't know I'm specialist in nothing. But I really enjoyed, and the book is with me. And what I wanted to ask is not a question. It's something to deal with the methodology and a little bit of awe, in the sense that going back again to that particular chapter, desire and history of emotions. So we are all into the same thing. And recently I have been reading a little bit of history of emotions things, and this is also where people are working on history of love in kavyas and other things. And there I find, I'm not talking of the theses, but I'm talking about the literature of the history of emotions, particularly from the Western point of view, that a lot of theoretical things are coming in, and people are like, ultimately when we're coming to examples, but we have like 15 pages on different theories of emotions and how to go about it. So sometimes I find it a little intimidating. And when I saw your chapter, I was reading, and you are just directly coming to this, our famous favorite Devadevan. And then you, of course, ask certain questions, which always bogs us also when we see those writings. So I often wonder, and I'm a great, like, I admire this kind of things because you come directly, but it is contextualized. It's not something that you are just putting in sources here and there. So my question is, how do you manage to keep yourself away from that trap of looking into all those very heavy theoretical things? And I remember reading that we all, like, there is a tendency for going into models, using those things into our thing, and which are sometimes absolutely not done because it doesn't match. So what is your method? How do you use your sources in such a beautiful way, but without falling into that trap of imitating those models or going into the detailed discussion on those things? So that was my thing.
Okay, thank you for another good question, Chandra. So, when I taught a course on the history of emotions, then of course I did talk about all the different theoretical models and emotionology, and all the different ways in which basically Western scholars have treated given various theoretical frameworks. But it depends on what kind of book you're writing. So if it is a PhD thesis, obviously there's going to be a long historiography and a lot of heavy detail about these things. This is a book, as I said, it's a book meant for general readers. What I do is I absorb, the insights from the theoretical models, but I did not think it was necessary in a book of this kind to start describing or giving a kind of exposition of these various models, because this is not something that is, you have to adopt the kind of approach that is suited to the kind of book it is and the audience that you are writing it for. So for this audience, that was not necessary. If I wrote a paper to be published in a historical journal, then certainly that some of that would come in there.
Thank you. And I think your use of visuals, like when you were doing this fantastic work on Sanchi, you concentrated only on of course, the theme was the inscriptions, but you have visited those a number of times, and maybe those, while even working from some such sources which are not related to visuals, which Sanjukta was saying. So visuals, you had seen those visuals, and visuals had come into your like psyche, in your mind, and maybe that things.
That's true. If you're working in archaeological sites and you're working
Right.
on inscriptions, they are associated with specific places, and there's a larger context, a material context and architectural context, and sculptures then the inscriptions have to be understood in association with the larger kind of the archaeological context, and also the sculptures at a site like Sanchi. So I think working on inscriptions makes you sensitive, makes it easier for you to kind of move into the domain of visual sources. Very often these are treated as separate. The inscriptions studied by epigraphists and historians who are doing historical analysis, the art, the sculpture studied by art historians. It really has to be brought together. Otherwise you cannot understand it. But for me, visuals are important, and these visuals I had to collect at the height of COVID, without being able to move anywhere. And there are such wonderful visual sources that are made available free by some of the major museums in the world, which are free to use. And I think that really came to my rescue, because otherwise collecting visuals is often a really big problem if you want to have them in your book. And for me, some people think that a book with pictures is somehow frivolous. For me, a book on ancient history without visuals it doesn't work. I think you would agree, Suchandra.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally.
But you also use visuals in a very big way.
Actually, I'm looking at some visuals now for everyday life, gambling and this. And so that I was thinking when I'm reading this book, and like these are all inspirations which we gather from various things. Thank you.
Upinder, there's one more question on the chat box on the artistic representation and political agenda from Ophira Kamble. Can you locate it or should I read it?
How do you differentiate between artistic representation and or political agenda of authors, creators, and the historical reality? Well, you know, whether, again, Ophira, that's a good question. You know, whether it is a text or whether it is a sculpture, you know, you would need to, it's not giving you an unmediated direct window into the past. So if it is a text, then you are going to look at the background, the genre of the text, the background of the authors, the agenda of the text, the audience, so on and so forth. And artistic representation, again, you would need to look at artistic style. You need to look at, you know, how much we don't even know in the context of ancient India. Individual authors, individual creators of artwork, they often remain anonymous. So, you know, it's a very, that's another aspect to this. But just giving you a quick answer, because I know time is up, you know, there is quite a bit of ancient Indian art which actually is political in nature. I mean, there's a combination. It's difficult to separate the religious and the political. And the example that immediately comes to mind is the Udayagiri. Okay, in Madhya Pradesh, the Udayagiri relief of Varaha lifting Prithvi from the oceans, which is, it is a depiction and an artistically very skillful and beautiful piece of art work, but it has a mythological significance. It's alluding to an important element in, you know, in the mythology of Vishnu, and at the same time, it is political allegory. You can see that in the Brihadishwar temple also. You know, the Cholas also have this kind of, there's a play between and deliberate ambiguity between God and king, which you can see in some instances. So it's a, what you asked is a very kind of, what shall I say? It's a profound question. A quick answer is what I can provide at this point of time.
Ma'am, I have a question to you.
Yes.
Hello. Well, my name is Shubhodash. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm a young researcher. I'm very impressed to see the in-depth analysis you have provided on the interesting topic. Well, when I see a strong discourse of violence that is highly related with the coming of foreign rulers, mainly Britain in the Indian subcontinent, why has not the discourse of violence that should have been stabilized, which was existent in the ancient India? So why it has been belittled in the context of, you know, circulating?
Are you asking me about the way in which ancient India is discussed as opposed to medieval Indian history and the kind of contrast? Is that the question?
Yes, that's a kind of contrast. I mean, in terms of a strong discourse which is related with the coming of foreign rulers, and not any kind of discourse with the violence past that we had in the Indian subcontinent.
Okay. I think, you know, there is this kind of stereotypical view of ancient India as marked by peace and harmony and tolerance. And part of that also has to do with the stereotypical of a kind of stereotypical contrast that is made with medieval times and, you know, what the kind of, let's say you know, after the Turkish invasions. So what I mean is that some of the historians who idealize ancient India are also the ones who would then kind of present this period of Indian history in terms of a stark contrast with the medieval period after the coming of Islam. Now, what is quite obvious, and that is obvious, I think, from political violence in ancient India and also in this book, is that violence is actually, these are all very obvious things, isn't it? It's kind of, if you read the history books, from the time of the 16 Mahajanapadas, and we are dealing with warfare and we're dealing with empire building, and violence is an intrinsic part of all that. So, by trying to kind of explore what it at one level is obvious, I think that should help also break down some of the notions that are associated again, at a popular level that people have in mind about ancient India and how, in certain respects, it's a great contrast to medieval times. In terms of violence, there is a continuous history of violence across the centuries, and that goes back actually to before the advent of the state. Okay, it's just that the documentation levels improve once we have historical sources.
All right, thank you very much, ma'am.
Manu message saying that he has a power cut there, so he has lost internet connection, and also we are slightly beyond our time, and I think unless there is any other questions, I would like to conclude this session on behalf of Manu, but also on behalf of iShore, by thanking Professor Upinder Singh for such a wonderful lecture on ancient Indian history and giving us a very broad idea of the nuances in which we can approach ancient Indian history with all its contradictions. And also thank you very much, Dr. Sanjukta Datta, for asking such insightful questions and also encouraging the author to think in tricky ways as well as in fruitful ways. And also, I would like to thank all the audience members, especially those who raised questions, Professor Sujandra Ghosh, Ofira Gamlail, and CN Subramaniam, and others. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us today on this panel. And with this, I formally conclude the session.
Thank you very much, Mahmood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Stop the